Psychic Purge is a sorcery that costs a single blue mana. When you cast Psychic Purge, it deals 1 damage to any target. That isn't a particularly great rate, but if this card is discarded by an opponent's effect, then that opponent loses 5 life. That is obviously a much better rate, so let's talk about Psychic Purge. Now, Psychic Purge is pretty outdated, and today I'm going to be talking about this card almost exclusively in old school 93-94 variants, where I think it's actually a pretty good card. The first thing I want to say is that this card is not the worst card to actually cast. Stuff like Royal Assassin, Prodigal Sorcerer, and even Savannah Lion see some level of play in old school, and you might also run into like a Goblin deck or something. I'm not saying you would run this card in your deck if it only dealt the 1 damage, and most of the time it won't be useful for that, but it certainly can come up. This card is limited by the fact that it's a sorcery, otherwise you could use it for stuff like Ball Lightning, which would make it way cooler, but dealing 1 damage isn't why you run this card, so I guess it's not that big of a deal. The main reason to run this card is to remove 5 life from your opponent when they Mind Twist you or hit you with a Hypnotic Spectre, or Hymn to Torak, or even Balance. If you have 4 extra slots in your sideboard and you're going to a 93-94 event, it might not be the worst idea to slot 4 of these into your sideboard when you inevitably run up against the Mind Twist and Hymn to Torak deck. Technically, you don't even have to be a blue deck to do this, since you really aren't going to be casting this in most circumstances. Now, I don't think this is a card you just slap into every sideboard, but if your plan is slower than the discard deck and you don't really have a solid way to deal with that kind of deck, this is a fairly inspired option. It's also the funniest shit in the world when it actually works, which brings up the main downside to something like this. It doesn't always work. Psychic Purge is one of the most efficient ways to deal a massive amount of damage to your opponent really quickly, but it does require a few specific things to happen. The obvious one is that the card needs to actually be in your hand when cards get ripped and needs to be ripped itself. And I guess you could say that about any card, right? Like, none of them are good if you don't have access to them. But this card in old school is very often random, which means you not only have to get lucky once, but at least twice, because you need the card in your hand, you need your cards to get ripped, and Psychic Purge needs to be one of the cards that gets ripped from your hand. A very funny thing to note about Psychic Purge, though, is in old school, I'm pretty sure this is the only card that allows you to win the game without ever getting a turn. If you're running 4 copies of Psychic Purge, and they're all in your opening hand, and your opponent drops a turn 1 Mind Twist for 7, they are losing 20 life, and they probably don't have a Healing Salve to cast in response to bring themselves back up to 3, which means an immediate loss. That is really fucking funny, but not something that you should plan to happen a lot. It's also worth noting that Psychic Purge loses them life if it gets discarded. It's a lot harder to prevent, and something like a Circle of Protection blue would do nothing in this situation. It's not really a huge deal, like these interactions don't really come up within the old school card pool, but it is worth noting, I suppose. Either way, I really like Psychic Purge. It's a really interesting card, and the designer of this card most definitely got Mind Twisted back in the day. I do think a card like this doesn't have too many homes, because most formats don't just let players drop their opponent's hand on turn 1. But in old school specifically, I think this card is pretty solid. It's also just a really interesting and unique idea. Like, having your cards trigger an effect when discarded is a really cool way to, like, balance discard effects. Still, discard strats are not very popular among the player base, and as the years have gone on, they've done less and less of it, meaning cards like this become even more niche and unnecessary. So, yeah. I don't know. I think this card is pretty neat and occasionally really fucking funny in old school, but I'm interested to see what you guys think of this card. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. But with that said, let's talk about the art. Psychic Purge was illustrated by Susan Van Camp, and I like this art. Susan is probably one of the more interesting artists, as her style got more and more goofy as she went on. Stuff like her version of Hymn to Torak is very fucking funny if you ask me, but during the earlier sets, she seemed to be taking the art more seriously, for lack of a better term. The art for Psychic Purge is just a bit fuzzy for my tastes, but that might just be artifacting from the scan, so it's hard to judge the art itself on that too intensely. It's definitely not anywhere close to my favorite art, but I certainly wouldn't call it a bad art. Human hands are exceptionally difficult to draw, and this hand is far from perfect, but I've definitely seen worse, even on magic art. I don't know. Overall, I think I would call this art fine. I'm pretty lukewarm on it, but I don't really have any criticisms of it. After all, art is subjective, so if you really like this piece, I understand that, but it just doesn't really speak to me. This is the only printing of Psychic Purge, at least in paper, but the Magic Online printing uses the same art, so it's really all we have to go over here. So I guess that's the end of the video. I do think Psychic Purge could see more play in old school variants, especially ones that allow Hymn to Torak, but it's also not a perfect silver bullet. There's a real opportunity cost to running this card, and while it certainly can come up, there will definitely be games where it sits in your hand with no chance of being discarded. But if you know you'll be running into Mind Twist, Hypnotic Spectre, Hymn to Torak, or even Balance, then Psychic Purge has the chance of being one of the funniest fucking things you'll ever see. It can very easily backfire on you though, so keep that in mind. At the end of the day, this card doesn't really do anything, and it's often a risky gamble to play something that's only good if your opponent does a specific thing. Still, I do think it's pretty likely that you'll run into that specific thing that this card helps against, at least in old school, where people run Mind Twist. But as always, I'd like to hear what you guys think in the comments. Otherwise, you can like the video if you liked it, you can subscribe if you give a shit, but either way, I hope you have a magical day. Thank you for watching.